Tended to agree that immigration was a problem, but of course there were two different minds on this. One said we need to help these poor immigrants. They're coming in and facing terrible conditions. The others thought we just needed to stop them from coming in altogether. Both these people were considered progressives, but they had opposite points of view. And there were a lot of immigrants, of course, coming into the country, and most of them were coming in, beginning in poverty and remaining in poverty. The idea of eugenics was created from Darwin's theories, and also the crossbreeding of plants. We're doing a lot of work crossbreeding plants to create new strains of plants. Most of the stuff you're eating in the grocery store was intentionally engineered by splicing plants together. We're also doing this with animals to create new breeds of animals. So Darwin's theory and this ability to crossbreed and create new things began to change how we think of the human race as well as plants and animals. There becomes this idea that some races are just simply genetically superior in a Darwinian sense. And then there becomes this fear that immigrants are coming in and destroying the good, superior, native, by native I mean white, of course, American stock. Americans, the belief is, are the winners in Darwin's genetic war, and Eastern Europeans are losers, and they're coming over here having babies with good old Americans, good old stock Americans, and ruining the race. Dillingham of Vermont begins a commission, he's a congressman, who argues we should limit immigration based on nationality. Nativist progressives, led by Teddy Roosevelt, will battle the employers. Those that want to keep the immigrants out, who believe in this idea of genetic American superiority, are locked in a political struggle with the employers who want as many immigrants as possible to keep wages down, obviously. And the employers, frankly, win this battle easily as we see basically open immigration, unless you're Chinese, of course, to America all throughout this period. And it won't be until World War I when we see immigration finally begin to taper off and become limited. But that's because of the war. That's not because there's any sort of change in mindset here in America. Here you see how you can tell if somebody is a Negroid sane criminal or a Negroid civil insane criminal by looking at the characteristics of their head and their face. That's eugenics. I know, it's lovely. Eugenics, by the way, of course, becomes the foundation for Hitler's ideas. Between 1900 and 1914, this is the high watermark for socialists, those people who believe we should move away from a capitalist system towards a more collective system. In 1900, in the presidential election, the socialist candidate, Eugene, gets less than 100,000 votes. That's Eugene v. Debs. By 1912, Debs gets more than 1 million votes, which is a pretty decent showing, of course, nowhere near winning. The sources of socialist support are things like urban immigration, particularly German and Jewish immigrants who have come from places where they've already begun to adopt some of these policies and see them as beneficial. Farmers actually tend to be socialist. We talked about the populists last chapter, and they were pretty much socialist. Now, there's a real spectrum here. Most socialists in America are patient, who simply want to vote for politicians, who support policies, who help people. But, of course, we do have a small group of radical socialists. The Wobblies are the international workers of the world. There's Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine wearing a wobbly hat. By the way, that's Debs on the left and the center, and then the guy on the right is Big Bill Haywood. He's the leader of the international workers of the world, or the Wobblies. They call for one union for all workers. And they begin to gain significant success. Now think about that. If all the workers of America unionized into one union, they would have enormous political power, and they could get what they wanted from the government. But they're blamed for a string of dynamitings, of which they probably didn't do. But this is frequent. This happens to unions all the time. They get blamed for violence that they weren't necessarily involved in to discredit them. Most socialists just want to educate, change the country slowly through elections. Socialists actually refused to support World War I, and they became victims of nationalism when government begins to root out traitors, that is, people who aren't enthusiastic enough about the war. And this will actually lead to the first Red Scare, which we'll talk about next chapter when we get to World War I. There's also a desire to attack bigness. Today we talk about companies being too big to fail. Well, back then, believe me, there were a lot of companies that were way bigger than the companies we're crying about today in terms of the percentage of the economy they controlled. And critics begin to point out that if you have giant steel companies and giant oil companies and giant everything else companies, you don't have competition. And the whole promise of the capitalist free market system is that competition would make everything better for everybody. But without competition, with monopolies, all you've created is an aristocracy of the owners of the large corporations. Louis Brandeis, a lawyer and a future Supreme Court justice, will lead a movement starting with a book he wrote in 1913 called Other People's Money, arguing that government should attack and break up monopolies. But other progressives didn't mind bigness. In fact, some progressives saw that these corporations as our best chance for maximum efficiency. And there became this great conversation in the country about what was a good monopoly, they called it trusts, and what was a bad trusts. Teddy Roosevelt was one of these people who wanted to segregate out what he considered to be a good, beneficial monopoly versus a bad, harmful monopoly. And we'll get into Teddy Roosevelt next and see how he tried to go about doing that.